It's a pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Kazys Varnelis, and it's also a pleasure to introduce someone who's developed a practice that defies easy categories, and Kazys Varnelis' practice certainly does that. One cannot easily describe Kazys as solely an architectural historian, a theorist, as an architect, or an urbanist. He writes history and theory books, numerous articles of architectural and urban theory. He teaches design studios at numerous schools, develops urban plans for many projects and exhibitions, but his practice seems to move effortlessly from one of these areas to another. I guess all of us architecture academics wear many hats, but some of us say, I'm a historian, I'm an architect, I'm an urban designer. But one of the things that's compelling about Kazys is his refusal to give his work an easy disciplinary title. It's exciting and inspiring. He practices something that is obviously very influential, because you can see students reading his books and blogs in the studio upstairs and constantly referring to his work. So Kazys' numerous accomplishments include authoring the books Blue Monday, The Infrastructural City, Networked Publics, and the Philip Johnson tapes. He has also authored the popular blog varnelis.net and numerous articles for journals such as Log, Volume, and Praxis. He is the director of the Network Architecture Lab at Columbia University, where he teaches design and seminar courses, and very recently, he was selected to develop a visionary urban design for Hong Kong as part of the Museum of Modern Art's upcoming exhibition, Uneven Growth, Tactical Urbanisms for Expanding Megacities. Please welcome Kazys Varnelis.
Well, thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I guess I'm going to get wired here in a second. All right. I just need to do one thing here. So I'll record this for my own purposes. And there we are. All right, looks good. So thank you again, David. Thank you all for having me here. Only one correction, I only teach studio at Columbia, so that otherwise you're absolutely, it was a great introduction. It is interesting to think of myself as someone who wears many hats, and in certain ways it's a kind of opportunism based on desperation and luck, bad and good, I suppose. But then one does want to just say, okay, that's the case. Then there are very positive things about it. And as you suggest, it's something that I try and turn into a certain kind of strength, or at least that's the hope. So. Today I'm going to give you an adult talk. They run about an hour, is that correct? I'm sorry, they don't want to take too long. We'll get the timer going here and cut myself off should I go any further. And my original plan was going to be to talk about the Dissident Future show at Yerba Buena, since I wrote an essay for the catalog. However, on Friday, I learned that that there was no way I could see the show, and the organizers didn't tell me quite why. And I was like, annoyed. I was like, well, is there a wedding going on there? Is like some big fundraiser? And then, of course, this is what's going on there, which is kind of very apt. So I'm still going to talk a little bit about the show, but I'm also going to talk about some other things that I thought as I scrambled on the plane yesterday to figure out what I would speak about. And I thought that what would be useful would be to, one, talk about some of the ideas that things that interest me about three of the artists in the show, and also to talk about this then maybe sort of bring up two other talks that I've given before, sort of revisit them in a very different way. One is maybe all of it would begin with a discussion that David and I had last year at this event at Columbia called Conflicts of Interest. It's also a discussion we kind of had online in which we discussed this topic of what research is for architects. And with that too, I think artists and designers as a whole, and maybe even this topic of what research may be, period. Because I think it's a very important one that still needs to be articulated in some ways, or or seriously discount that in some ways, just that needs to be articulated because it has not been enough. And the second, related to that then, would be a second talk I gave in 2007 that was the instigator for all of that, a talk I gave at ACSA that similarly I had to put together at the last minute. And I wrote it because I was asked at the last minute to come there. And I wrote it while my wife drove me to Philadelphia. And in-laws said, hey, we'll take care of the kids for the weekend. We said, oh, Philadelphia, okay, a weekend away from the kids, but I have to write the talk. So it turned out that was kind of the basis of this article I've written, is their research in the design studio. And so I wanted to revisit that question again, as well as then talking about my own work and the work of the Network Architecture Lab and what I have been doing at Columbia. In that, I think that there's a kind of response to architectural research and to what it might mean to be to do that and to be speculative. I'll try to revisit some of these questions of something that's emerged that Pedro Gadanho, who is the curator at MoMA, and who organized the show that I'm very lucky to be a part of, raised previously this question of architecture fiction, but along with that, maybe a question of what an architectural nonfiction might be like, that would be not just banal or obvious, but rather that might be as speculative, or maybe even more speculative than forms of architecture fiction. And in doing so, then present some of my works. If any of that makes sense, then perhaps you'll want to stay for the talk. So yeah, if we began with Apple, it kind of fit very well because I wanted. What I was interested in about the show that the curators at Yerba Buena put together was that it was making a kind of sort of explicitly made a departure from the just kind of disruptive technologies, in quotes, that we're so familiar with, whether it's here in San Francisco or for that matter in New York City, the world of startup, of Kickstarter videos, of the next big thing. Here is the next big thing, as somebody just the other day, or maybe even today, proposed this iWatch design concept. And every next big thing, on the one hand, kind of it promises transformation, but at the same time, it does so in what's, I think, to us, an entirely predictable way. I mean, yes, we might not know what the impact of an iWatch is. We might not know if it will be successful. Perhaps we. Stephen Becker and I were talking about this afterwards. Joseph Becker and I were talking about this after Javier's symposium or seminar, and he was saying, like, well, is it that these things will never come out because they're too risky? Is it that Apple will not produce such a thing because if they did, it might fail, and that would just be an egg on their face that they can't handle. So the question is this kind of and I think there's some real truth to that we've kind of passed a certain moment in network culture, by which I mean the kind of the contemporary culture we live in which the next big thing, if it promises transformation, if there's a constant search for it, if on the one hand sites like this one, all these sort of fanboys and fangirl sites are out to look for the next big thing, and if venture capitalists are also out looking for it, looking for the next technological disruption, there's also a kind of degree of self-evidentness to it. There's nothing. It's no longer this world. It's no longer the world of modernity. For the moderns, for people like Mies van der Rohe, modernization was something that promised to shatter the world they were born into. It was this promise of change, this promise of potentially utopian change, or for that matter, for some others like Paul Klee or Walter Benjamin, a change that was ongoing and so disruptive it was very dark and dangerous. That kind of change is not something that I think that we live with deep in our cores the way the moderns did. The art historian T.J. Clark, who teaches at Berkeley, has written in his book Farewell to an Idea that modernity is our antiquity. That is, that we cannot, that it's our past. It's a world we refer to, but it's a world we can't comprehend. Just as people walking around the Renaissance or the Middle Ages or in the 19th century could not comprehend the world of the Romans or the Greeks. They had no idea what that world was really like. If something was lost, there was a caesura between then and now. And I think that that's something that we do experience. This world where change is happening, and it's radical, and it will shake you to the core. A world that Karl Marx said, a world in which all that is solid melts into air. That modernist project, that project of modernization, and its forms of representation, as Clark points out, are incomprehensible to us. It's a very different world from this promise of rupture and promise of undoing the contemporary city to I watch design concepts. Perhaps I'm wrong. Feel free to argue with me on that. It would be nice to hear I'm wrong and weird. But then we aren't postmodern either. And if postmodernism was predicated on a deep condition of skepticism about technology, that's not where we are either. For example, the author Leo Marx, a historian in 1991, as late as that, was able to say that wrote that people are deeply pessimistic about technology in our age, that there's the technology is not going to give any kind of better life for us. We've experienced the world of the atomic bomb, the failures of technology, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. The space race has ended. There's nothing really new between, say, the world of the 1960s and the world of the 1980s, early 90s. It was true. There wasn't that big a difference in technology. You might have now written your essays on word processors, but on the whole, it didn't, there wasn't a kind of earth-shaking change that in fact, since 1991, and Leo Marx wrote, that we have had. In other words, that we've restarted the clock for technology, and we've restarted the idea that technology will progress over the last 20 years. And yet, unlike the world of the moderns, we no longer have a kind of faith that it will deliver us into, as Colin Rowe said in his book, The Architecture of Good Intentions, into it was no longer the good news of technology and modernism is no longer that it will lead to a kind of state of grace. It's that it'll just be an exacerbated, ever more intense version of the same. And I mean, to some degree, I think that there's a question of this being linked to our contemporary economic condition. Gopal Balakrishnan, a brilliant historian who teaches in history of consciousness at Santa Cruz, talks about our time as being a stationary state marked by a stagnation of neoliberalism, but also a lack of clear alternatives to it. We are no longer in the era of Johnny Rotten singing "No future for me, no future for you," but there is a future, but it's a kind of, again, it's a sense that this future is, it's already, at most, it'll be found on Kickstarter, and we can all think of it. And there's a kind of liberating quality. We can all come up with the next big thing. We can all get Kickstarter funded, and there's something kind of great about that kind of potential. At the same time, there's how we will get out of this quagmire is beyond us, and whether it's and the same with politics. If we look at, and one of the aspects of Infrastructural City was to suggest that, in the introduction that I wrote, was to suggest that there is a kind of there's due to NIMBYism, due to political stalemate, and the kind of incredible complexity of contemporary politics and life, that there's a kind of stalemate to infrastructure now, that infrastructure will not solve our problems anymore. And this has now happened at an economic level and a political level. We just saw it, with the shutdown of Congress, and now the Senate Republicans were like to the Tea Party, like, well, what were you thinking? Of course you weren't going to accomplish anything. There's now, everybody's kind of going back, but they're still not going to accomplish anything. Similarly, there's, whether if you were to look at what the program for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or if you were to look at what people on Wall Street might say, there are these kind of forward-looking programs are in essence kind of gone. They're no longer like the great program of social welfare and the Great Society, for example, that Lyndon Johnson might have had. Or for that matter, Ronald Reagan and his belief in ending the Cold War and victory over the Soviet Union. So from the left or the right, those two perspectives. So there's something about our era, too, in terms of economy and politics that kind of cements this. So what interested me about the show, Dissident Futures, was that the work there proposes that the future may is something we should really think about. And it may be in a utopian idea, in a utopian measure, or it may be, in many cases, in a dystopian condition. And the three works I just want to very briefly look at before I talk about some other ideas and some of the things that I've done, and this idea of architecture research. In fact, we can just launch it with these three works, is these three works that I wrote about in my catalog essay suggest that there might be, that thinking about the future is in fact imperative and urgent, and maybe we need to think about it in different ways than say the moderns did. Instead of thinking about a world that will radically transform, in which there will be a kind of a rupture, and in comes the great crystal iceberg of the Friedrichstrasse skyscraper. Perhaps we need to think about some of the conditions of the future that might not be so good. This is Future Cities Lab, and this is a project called the Theater of Lost Species. And forgive me if I get some of this info wrong, but you can correct me if you know better. But as I understand it, this work, what is so great, this work, and which I'm really intrigued by, is that this work, which looks like a kind of massive phytoplankton or some kind of massive underscale sea creature, overscale sea creature, is that this work is meant to recall or to be a kind of display that would allow you to interact with these kind of extinct species from the very great past, or to computer-generated versions of this animal life that was exterminated 252 million years ago during what was called the Permian Extinction. And the Permian, so this kind of a monument to an extinction that happened 252 million years ago, something we don't think about, and yet it was the largest single mass extinction in Earth's history, and it was basically, as scientists now think, it was caused by a massive influx of carbonic gas from a volcanic area known as the Siberian Traps. And that volcanic gas caused chemical changes that then wiped out most Earth life. So if you look into this device, you can see and interact with these creatures, or at least virtual simulations of these creatures from the great past. And yet it's not just, say, a science exhibit about the past, but yet it's also meant to make us think about the fact that the same scientists or other scientists are suggesting that the amount of carbon we are adding to the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels is causing similar changes and may cause a similar extinction. So that is that we are on the cusp of this change, and that the next generation is not just going to lose, small creatures in the sea they never see again, but rather that the next generation, or even our children's generation, will not know familiar animals like pandas or elephants or tuna, or because they will be gone, because the changes that we are making right now, even with all of our supposedly green LEED certified measures, are just simply not enough. So this was a project that I thought was very interesting in how it brought up this question of the future and our own complicity in changing it. A similar project, but on a different tack, is by Trevor Paglen, who is a geographer, and he just recently moved from the Bay Area to New York City. And Trevor has been noted for doing things like following or identifying where the torture taxis, the kind of planes used for extraordinary rendition, where they flew, and for various kinds of sort of counter surveillance, counter sort of exposure of various kinds of shifty U.S. government actions. Particularly by the military and the CIA and others. And in this case, he took what appears to be this set of photographs of star trails, and yet there are some odd things on the star trails that move at different angles and so forth. And so this piece is titled Singleton SBW-ASS-R1 and 3 Unidentified Spacecraft from a space-based wide area surveillance system. And in this case, he took these photographs, again, these kind of long exposure night photographs with a telescope to expose these tracks of military surveillance satellites that are orbiting high above the Earth in geosynchronous orbit. These are satellites that are produced by a very large black budget that has that allows the U.S. government, the military, to and other entities to monitor much goings on throughout the world at a level that we are not even allowed to understand. I mean, we're sure they can read license plates, but how much can they read, and what are they surveilling? We don't quite know. Yet, at the same time, but what does that have to do with the future? Well, Paglen has pointed out that these same satellites, as well as others, but all of these military satellites that are in geosynchronous orbit, 22,236 miles above sea level, these are between the Earth and the Moon. They're not only circle every 24 hours, so they're geosynchronous. They also are basically balanced between the Earth and the Moon, and they will survive not years, they won't just survive decades. They will survive millions, thousands, or even millions of years. They enter into geologic time. Paglen suggests that in the future, when all life on Earth may be extinct, we have made ourselves extinct, and there might not even be any trace of us. And these satellites will remain surrounding the Earth. And he suggests in a kind of very evocative statement, recalling Eric von Däniken and the kind of the ancient aliens arguments, in the future we are the ancient aliens, which I think is a kind of amazing statement, and kind of recalls also a moment in the 17th century when I think it was Francis Bacon suggested that said that we are the ancients. That is, that writing of the Greeks and the Romans suggested that in fact they existed in civilizations early period, but but the 17th century was already a late period, so they were the ancients as opposed to people of the youth. This kind of inversion of that, but still kind of bringing up this question of what becomes of us and what will become of us in part because of things like this. And the final work that I wanted to bring up was by Katie Patterson. She's only graduated art school in 2007, but she is, I think, one of the most brilliant young artists today. And this is a project called The History of Darkness. This is 2,200 slides with handwritten titles. She has produced this kind of body of works that look at a kind of astrophysical timescale and a kind of deep solitude, a kind of solitude of the longue durée, or solitude of deep time, that resists our condition of atemporality, our condition of extremely short time spans, whether it's the Twitter feeds we subscribe to, or the world of high finance and high-speed trading, which operates at millisecond and even microsecond levels. So she resisted with interest in this kind of extreme time, extremely long times, and even into the future. So in this case, this is a work in which she collects images of darkness on slides and the images of darkness are taken by astronomers of places in the night sky where there are no stars. They're that far away that they can't be, there is no light there, or perhaps they're blocked by clouds or something. And so she hand titles each slide when she receives it with a distance from the Earth in light years. And the fact that she's putting it on slides, even though what she's putting on there is just a little black piece of film, also suggests that the future unreadability of data and the fact that slides, at least until the physical medium will decay, remain kind of legible as indexes of what they are. Any alien could as long as they can see in the same wavelengths as us and have a light, can hold up a slide and get it. Whereas an alien might look at this and just say, "Oh, it's a cookie," and then eat it, because after all, what would they think? So silicon, glass, cookie. So I think that what her work does is, given again this kind of environmental devastation that's posing an existential risk to us, it points towards the potential of our own disappearance, the cosmic insignificance of everything that we've accomplished. So all these works, I think, interested me in terms of the way they regarded the future, and I think all these works took on, whether it's working with astronomers, the photographs of the night sky, and also working with amateur satellite trackers who identified some of these, or working with the scientists that Future Cities Lab did to discuss this, kind of find out how about these lost cities and lost species and simulate them. I think there's already a kind of all three evidence, a kind of research in architecture and art. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit now for the next 2/3 of this talk, what it might mean to do research in our fields, because we talk about it, we do research before we design, or sometimes we take a research studio, but to some degree, what does it mean? And maybe a kind of over-hasty discussion of this, I can start with an over-hasty discussion of this. It's really meant, if anything, not to give you any kind of history of it in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but rather to bring up some moments in the history of architectural research as a kind of not even first draft, but set of notes, an outline towards a discussion about what research might be in this field. We could argue that research has been going on for a long, long time in architecture. If we were to look at, for example, Vitruvius, who talks about the need for understanding mathematics, the need for understanding where the wind comes from, the necessity of understanding the materials one is working with. So there's that kind of level of research. There's also a level of research that existed throughout the Renaissance and into the 18th and 19th centuries, a kind of research into architecture itself, into proportion, for example. This is Perrault's Ordonnance, and his attempt to understand the kind of the first principles of architecture, to understand the proportions of the orders, to understand what is absolute to this work, what is pure and disciplinary, and also the mathematics underneath this. By finding a mathematical basis to architecture, Perrault was hoping, I think, to find a kind, to give it more rigor. And of course, this is a kind of moment when, in fact, it's architecture's status is in doubt. In the 17th century, it's beginning to finally get in doubt. Is it a science? Is it something, in essence, is it something that has rigorous rules, or is it arbitrary? What about these things? Yes, we know if you can make things that fall down, but what about these orders? Are they rigorous? Are they real? Or are they arbitrary? What is the case for this? And yet, architecture remains, one of the, as far as something involving making, it remains pretty much, at the time, really the only kind of coherent body of, because through Vitruvius, it's the only kind of coherent text that came down to that era from the Romans, explaining how you made things in a kind of relatively cohesive, even a flawed approach. So, architecture became a kind of model, especially as you began having this kind of new world of what was called the mechanical arts, like printing. Joseph Moxon, who invented the printing press, or not invented the printing press, sorry, who wrote a book on the printing press in England, the first book on how to be a printer in England, and was a printer. So pointed to Vitruvius and said, this is the basis for this book on printing, because this is a systematic way of making something, and it's based on research, and we will therefore turn to it in terms of trying to understand how to be a printer, which is kind of printing was a question of engineering and mechanics, right? At a time when this was one of the first, the printing press, in a sense, the printing press and the clock are kind of the first two real machines that emerge. And so there's that, and then of course there's a kind of a research that is more, let's say, begins to be more rigorous and archaeological than even what Perrault did. This case is Dominique Vivant-Denon, and this is from a 1802 text or book of A Visit to Egypt, and trying to measure the Sphinx. And of course we have Stuart and Rivette going to Greece, and archaeologists trying to understand, to get to these proportions, to really do research to figure it out. What is the proportion of these orders, and how did the ancients use them? And of course, they found out they just did whatever, not entirely what they wanted, but largely. And so that went out the window. They found out they couldn't do that. But it was still a kind of question of attempting to produce research, historical research based on an archaeology, trying to understand what architecture's basic principles were from that sort of study. But then there are other forms of research too that already are emerging at this time. I mean, you could take that might parallel or might begin to inform this idea that that has emerged over the last decade, or this term. It's not a new term, idea at all, but this term that Pedro has used, I've used, Bruce Sterling has used. I think Bruce may actually be the originator of the term, but this idea of architecture fiction. That is, that a fiction that is produced not solely or not even at all through narrative, but rather is produced with the tools of architects, produced by drawing. This is the Carceri of Piranesi. And Piranesi was an architect. He also spent a lot of time drawing things that people would, that young British gentlemen would bring back with them as souvenirs from their trips, from their grand tour. But in this case, the Carceri were these fantasies of a kind of prison world beyond belief, and we still, I think, don't really know what Piranesi was out to do with this, but to kind of intensely provoke us, a form of research, if you will, a kind of exercise of speculation. He also did the same thing with his quasi-archaeological, but really much more speculative work on the infrastructure of Rome, and looking at the Cloaca Maxima and the sewers underneath Rome. Similarly, in the 19th century, we have a different kind of speculation, a kind of in the 18th and 19th century, kind of endless production, the work of the Beaux-Arts, an endless production of design, of form as a kind of research, right? A production of architecture architectural plans, of architectural drawings, of different schemes to try and understand how architecture might best suit spaces and might best be ordered. Again, moving very, very fast through the centuries. And then we might have Hermann Mutesius in 1904, a German architect going to England to try and understand the English house and how the English lived as a way of trying to bring back information to Germany. This going abroad, not to study the past, but to study other contemporary buildings, became very important as a form of research at the time, whether it was and I've run across architects who would go to look at other building types to understand them, whether it was Eric Gunnar Asplund going to travel around much of Europe to try and understand libraries, to build the Stockholm City Library, whether it was, and I don't remember his name, but he was Henry Smith Miller's grandfather, and I think he was Henry Smith, what was it? I forget he had another last name, but he was actually Henry Smith Miller's grandfather. He was a Chilean architect who built, Henry Smith Solar, who built the University of Valparaiso in Chile, and you go there and you look and it looks like Yale, and of course it was because he was given this charge of building this new university in Chile, so he went to look at Yale and Oxford and all these other universities in order to understand how you build a proper university. So this idea that Mutesius, for example, going abroad to look at how successful works of architecture had been that's another kind of form of research that architects have historically taken on. Greta Schutlihotsky and other architects associated with Ernst May's project in Frankfurt, but also many other modern architects examined how people the work people did, and basing their this is work done towards the development of the Frankfurt kitchen, trying to understand the way that we do things, trying to kind of break things down in a manner that would be similar, say, to the kind of Fordist or Taylorist engineering methods of trying to understand how we work from an engineering perspective. So using stop motion photography, using measuring how people do things. How does one hold one's spine when one is doing work? What's kind of the impact of that on the human body? Alto was doing this, Asplund as well. And then, of course, there's structural research and a kind of experimentation, again, that might actually be in some ways akin to the experimentation of the Beaux-Arts. This is Walter Netsch at the Air Force Academy. And the Cadets Chapel, where and kind of standing for the kind of experimentation with engineering and technology and new methods of fabrication that has a kind of high point in the post-war era and has, in essence, returned to us recently. And probably it's this form of research, and maybe with a bit of this form of research, that then begin to parallel the work of being done in Cold War universities. That's begin to parallel the kind of the research into engineering, into high technology, and into science. And perhaps the kind of epitome of this is, and unfortunately my images of this just didn't come out, so you'll have to, but this is a pretty nice one still. This is of, would be probably the epitome of this would be Nicholas Negroponte's work at MIT in the 60s. So Negroponte, who's now famous as this kind of internet pundit and former head of the Media Lab, was actually an architect, and he did his PhD at MIT, which was a school that early on had PhDs that were not just devoted to history and theory, but were devoted to, in fact, research. And Negroponte parlayed very quickly, partly through having a brother who was high up in the defense industry and was later Secretary of the Defense, George Negroponte. Nicholas wound up using grants to create this media lab, right? And initially it was called the Architecture Machine Group. And in the Architecture Machine Group, he experimented with the effects of computerization on the environment. So in ways, so in this case, this is a project called Seek, in which he had, and you don't see a kind of punchline, but it's still, you know, kind of nice image here. What he had was these blocks that were filled this giant tank, this glass-walled space, and it was full of gerbils. And then there was a robot. And then when the gerbils, a robot arm, and when the gerbils knocked over a block, the robot arm came and moved and sort of straightened out the blocks. So there's kind of endless kind of taking of gerbil world and kind of tweaking it with the arm. In the end, this project may not have amounted to much, kind of didn't go too well. It was shown at this infamous and very famous, but also kind of deeply flawed exhibit called, I think it was 1970, curated by Jack Burnham at the Jewish Museum as a kind of culmination of a series of shows previously on minimal art, conceptual art, and this was called Software. And in the show, this kind of didn't go well because the gerbils started eating each other, and it was kind of a dystopia in a way. But other projects went much better, and the Architecture Machine Group explored things like virtual reality, which was, of course, used by the military, but for example, in fighter planes, for heads-up displays, for simulators, they developed various simulation technology, and of course, they developed the desktop metaphor that we use today, and many of the kind of principles of modern user interface were developed with the Architecture Machine Group that arguably was more influential on computation than the Media Lab has been. And I think that this moment, this kind of hand in hand, was a very key moment. This going hand in hand of architecture, going towards research, and also a kind of Cold War mentality, an interest in Cold War defense. And we're still kind of living in the aftermath of that. And when we think of, you know, of these devices we have that derive from it, we also should be thinking also about what maybe the original purpose of some of these projects was. And of course there was also this is Berkeley, right? So there was also great disruption at this time. Universities were in trouble. Not only was government aid evaporating, new technologies requiring massive investment, there was the war going on, and the result was there was this. Perversely, at that moment, what happened was as universities began to respond by creating larger lecture courses and began to have to, because of the baby boom, they began to have to hire a great number of faculty. They responded by creating more graduate programs, and they responded by expanding particularly doctoral programs in the history of architecture, giving rise to, in fact, the whole discipline of, in many ways, the whole discipline of architecture history. So there's that side of it. And then also at this time, there are projects like Learning from Las Vegas that are expressly based on kind of research, based on research going into a city, examining it, trying to extrapolate from it. And then some projects that are very potent to me and that will point in the direction of some of the things the Netlab does. In the late 60s, of course, we have projects like Super Studio or Archizoom, projects that produce a kind of architectural research based on speculation. So rather, especially in Archizoom's case, say rather than going out and trying to identify some kind of factual, or just some kind of data that they could mine and then doing some kind of thesis out of it, Andrea Bronzi, the leader of Archizoom, begins with the condition of a kind of completion of modernity, a kind of the spread of the market and the spread of capitalism throughout the entire world. And he suggests that in this case, and with the development of telecommunications, we have now reached a point where we don't need cities. So instead, everything will be a city. We'll live in a totally urban world. And he comes up with this kind of dystopian image of architecture fiction called No Stop City, where he produces these very large buildings that he says are based on the supermarket and the office building. He describes these as being nothing more than well-equipped parking lots that are well-conditioned parking lots with HVAC. They seem to have an uncanny similarity to office landscape and to the kind of the flattened hierarchies of offices that are being made at that time. They also have this kind of uncanny similarity to the kind of world being promoted by Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth catalog. And again, it kind of becomes a kind of work of architecture fiction, yet I think it also is a form of research. It's a form of research that provokes provokes us to think about the future, provokes us to think about our world. I mean, these buildings, this world being produced before Walmart, before the contemporary condition of sprawl that has developed. And yet, it obviously is a very different idea of research than what we might have in the university. Then, don't worry, this crazy history will end very soon. And then, in the 70s, maybe a kind of backlash back to history, postmodernists like Michael Graves, turning towards research that was based on history, based on quotations, on finding, using history as a mine to produce new forms of architecture. Something that in some respects still exists to this day, as architects may no longer do postmodern work, but kind of endlessly mine the past for architectural elements. There was also research based on critical theory. In this case, Peter Eisenman and Jeffrey Kipnis literally both trotting out the Wexner Center. The research done by the theorist, the research done by the architect go together, hand in hand, to produce this. We're nearly done with this part. But then there's also, before you lose patience with this, we also have again a kind of the resurgence of structural innovations, the Guggenheim Bilbao being not only a matter of structural innovation, but being a matter of new forms of software or new kinds of software that had not previously been used in architecture. And Gehry himself, starting with his building, starting with the Disney Concert Hall, begins to have to one-up himself and one-up his office for a period of time to try and design ever more structurally sophisticated, structurally complex buildings. So with that in mind, there become, in the last, let's say, starting around 2000, there was a kind of explosion of interest in research that comprised a series of these books, many of them coming out of the work of, initially out of the work of OMA, kind of architects taking on the project on the city, year-long projects that, in which, oh, weird. How did that happen? I guess I was having some fun with this once. And this sort of endless series of books by people like OMA, by, I didn't really have fun with PowerPoint like this, MVRDV, in order to explore what, certain kinds of conditions, whether it's conditions of overpopulation and kind of great density, like in the Costa Iberica project, whether it's Lagos, whether it's China, the Great Leap Forward, whether it's the shopping book. All of this interest in research that architects were taking on, that was very powerful and very pregnant for a while, but kind of curiously didn't necessarily lead to that much, simply because there wasn't that much thought about where it was going to go. And so not that what I'm going to do is going to lead to much, but my interest has then been in sort of maybe against that world, against a world where these answers might be simpler, against a world where, even though I respect the work of multiplicities, for example, and of course, the work of this body of research that was done at this time was really important. As when we began by founding AUDC and later at the Netlab, I was interested in other ideas about how one could speculate. And if architecture fiction is something potent that's developed lately, I began to get interested in how nonfiction and documentaries had taken on a new life in the last decade. And this is the kind of Werner Herzog, the filmmaker who is interested in what he calls an ecstatic truth. He's interested in the possibilities of what nonfiction can give us, a world that may actually seem to be stranger than fiction. In this case, this is from Lessons of Darkness, a project about the oil wells of Kuwait when they were set on fire by the retreating Iraqi army. And at this, Herzog himself has said, our entire sense of reality has been called into question. In other words, what events like this, the world, the strangeness of the world around us, scenes like this have called into question for him, and for myself and many people, I think as well, have called into question whether the nonfiction in our world, the reality of our world, is stranger than anything we could imagine. And Herzog talks about what he sees the world as this kind of ecstatic truth, trying to uncover the madness in our own world and trying to display it to others. Now, one difference between Herzog and ourselves is that Herzog does create a kind of fictional account of the non-fictional scenes he makes. So he's kind of known for scripting interviews and taking some liberties. We don't quite do that, but we are interested in trying to look at ways of speculating using nonfiction that might be akin to that. So just a couple of projects that we've done over time. This is a book that I published with Robert Summerall. AUDC is the primary practice that I have outside of Columbia, a kind of speculative media venture. Robert was a student of mine at SciArc. And this book, Blue Monday, gathered together these three main stories about the world. They were attempts to try and explain the individual, the role, the plight, if you will, of the individual in contemporary society. And you really would have to read them to understand what we were interested in. But each of these stories, if we used each of these stories to explain something about ourselves and about our world, each of these stories also was profoundly strange, which is what attracted us to them. The first of these was about One Wilshire, this building that exists in Los Angeles. You may have seen it. It's quite banal. Here it is from the Standard. It looks kind of interesting because you have this thing from the Standard in the front, but it's really not. It's really not a very interesting building at all. But the thing about the building is that the building, and okay, this is a case where Robert decided that he wanted to create a little bit of ecstatic truth himself. He couldn't stand the 6x5 bays of One Wilshire, so he redrew them. As you know, in this case, he did the 6x5 bays, but in the model, he had to change it to 4x5 because the proportions were just so bad. But otherwise, the text is all completely completely true. Didn't make up anything in that. But we also were interested in a kind of slippage between what we as architects might do, the tools of the architect, the drawing, the model, the axon, and even the photograph, and what might exist in real life and what might exist in the text. So One Wilshire is this kind of neutral grid, this really uninteresting structure, about as uninteresting and banal a building as you could have, and yet it's also a building that has a story, and the story is that for some historical reasons that I won't get into now in the interest of time, the building has become a primary destination for fiber optic lines in Los Angeles, even the West Coast, and even the world. It was a decade ago the most connected space on Earth, and still maybe. I would have to actually. I haven't seen anything to the contrary. Basically, the building is not too far from the Central Switching Station in Los Angeles and the SBC Central Switching Station. And when the AT&T was deregulated, the SBC was forced to allow access to its lines within that building, and yet they weren't forced to give any kind of larger space to the to companies that might want to install servers or other equipment there when Wilshire was conveniently down the street. So thus cell phone companies and so forth began to, and long distance carriers began to move in there. They placed microwave, it was a good spot for microwave antennas. They put those on top. They aren't used very much anymore, if at all. It's obsolete, the bandwidth is too low. But the building then began to attract fiber. And over time, what happened was on the 4th floor of the building, the owners of the building created what's called a meet me room, which means that if you rent space there, you can connect between any other your server, your equipment, to anything else to any other server in that floor. And so you could be like a Guatemalan phone card company, a Lithuanian phone card company, and you know you're going to get some calls. So you connect between them, so you're going to connect them with a fiber optic run. And then then the result is you don't have to pay a third party for that. So thus, there's a kind of self-perpetuating cycle of this becoming a hub that only grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And we were interested in it also as a place that manifested the net. It manifested the world of media we want to live in, and yet it did so, in a sense, without any kind of architectural expression that, I mean, that was anything but banal. We were interested in the kind of the placelessness of this building, and yet a building that in many ways is a kind of acropolis, a building we want to dwell in, a building in which we upload ourselves into as if it were the kingdom of God itself, and we go on quite a bit about this, and referring to various critical theories to do this. And I'm not going to try to compress this all, but we were very interested in trying to understand how maybe architecture and even our lives are already at this point fiction, as we begin to dwell in spaces like this telematically, even without knowing it, even without thinking about it, but still wanting to be there. Another story we told in Blue Monday was about the story of the Muzak Corporation. The Muzak Corporation was a corporation that recently went bankrupt. They produced canned music, music that was very popular in the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s and 80s, in which they would take love songs and other pop hits and they would strip them of their lyrics and reorchestrate them with violins. This music was meant to be seen, to be heard and not listened to. It was meant to be in the background, kind of ambient music that would allow you to work during the day. It was insipid, it was annoying, it was kind of cloying and sickly sweet, but it was also based on this theory, this scientific theory based on research. You could get these research reports on how Muzak performed in the Lever House, for example, most of which is now proven to be like fake research. It really didn't, it really wasn't real. And yet, Muzak, its hypothesis was that it could stimulate you when you were tired and calm you down when you were overstimulated. So you get to work, you're too stimulated, calms you down. Later, when you're feeling a bit tired, it peps you up. And what we identified was that Muzak, quite consciously, was based on something called a Hawthorne Effect, which was a hypothesis in sociology and operations management that suggested that individuals would produce more no matter what you did, as long as you just constantly changed their environments. So like it was based on the idea that these two women were studied, and at first they kind of reduced the hours they worked all the time and gave them better and better conditions, and all the time they became more productive until they finally restored them back to like their full 40-hour weeks. And the women were even more productive than they ever were with like before. So they realized that all that mattered wasn't actually being nice to your workers. It was, or at least according to this hypothesis, it was just constantly making them think they were subject to a kind of perpetual conditioning, a kind of perpetual training, perpetual modification. So in this project on Muzak, we looked at that, and we looked at the kind of the creation of a culture of horizontality, and also questioned whether what our own desires are within this world, whether we want to resist this at all costs, or do we do things constantly that are encouraging that. And the final of those projects, I'll kind of finish up by looking at the Netlab briefly. The final of these projects was at Quartzsite, Arizona, a town of 5,000 in the summer that has over 1.5 million in the winter, and they all come there with their RVs. And what interested us about Quartzsite, obviously that interested us about Quartzsite, but it's a place that it's a kind of emergent condition, if you're familiar with that term from network theory. It's a place that, in a sense, as we suggest, is a place that is a eruption of what Michael Hart and Antonio Negri call the multitude, and yet it also demonstrates all the problems with that it is a place, it's a place without any hierarchy. There is no, there's a police force and everything, but it's really a place that's self-governing. Most of those RVs are parked on government land, and you can live there for up to 3 weeks without having to move. You can park there for free, or maybe it's like $20 or something, very little. Another thing is they may look awful to the environment. They're actually very sustainable. During those 3 weeks, you have to live off, unless you want to move a lot, you have to live off one water tank in one of these things. You'll try and live on just, maybe, I don't know, 100 gallons. It can't even be 100 gallons in there. Not many gallons of water. Probably like 30 gallons, I would imagine, would be in one of these. So you don't take showers very often. You can't bring very much onto these things. You can't own many possessions because each possession you put on ruins your gas mileage. And then, and also electricity. There's no electricity out there. So these are people who live on extremely minimal, even though it doesn't seem it, they actually live in extremely minimal ecological footprints. It's kind of a blueprint for the future, if you will. And yet it's also, and the whole reason it exists is because of, in essence, because of this. There's a rock show there, and we mean rocks like this, not music, every year. And you can go there and you can buy rocks, which then people have congregated there to sell rocks or to visit the show, and yet they don't, as we said, you can't really bring them on your RV anyway because they're too heavy. What would you do with the rocks, once you went there? I mean, there are some people who bring some things very commonly. They'll bring like a field of astroturf, like you see there, and maybe like a street lamp to like create a little atmosphere in front of their RV. But, you're not going to be able to take all these rocks with you. So, and in fact, you don't really need to pay for them anyway, because you could just go into the mountains, because this is where many of the rocks come from. The mountains nearby have a lot of rocks you could just pick up for free. So the interest here was about how this world that had been created of these, around an economy of nothing. Most of these people are retired, so mind you, they do have an economic basis in Social Security and pensions, but at the same time, a world in which the economy becomes something other, a kind of excuse to meet, not anything productive, and yet there's a sense where it's complete dystopia, although this is a helicopter shot that makes it look pretty good, repeatedly I've had students or friends or colleagues try and visit it and say, oh yeah, it looks so amazing, and they go and they come back and the projects never get done. I took students there once, and little by little, out of 30 students, one by one, they would come to me and say, I'm not going to do a project there. I'd rather do a cemetery, something more cheery. They said. This one woman insisted, she was a photographer, she insisted that it was going to be, that I was wrong. She said she was going to go there and she was going to take photographs. And I saw her a while later, and I asked, how did that go? Did you do that? She said, well, I decided I want to go in the mountains and take photographs of rocks there. I was like, oh, very interesting, So there's a kind of quality, and I don't have, if you look through Blue Monday, you'll see some of these the images of the surface. There's a kind of utterly anti-aesthetic quality to this place that if anything fascinates, but also talks about its kind of dystopianness. So just to finish, maybe 10 more minutes, or go 5 minutes over if you can handle that, is that, so what have we done at the Netlab? Well, the Netlab is kind of based on on my interest and suggestion that these things are transformative, even if it may be a kind of banal transformation, but it is a radical one, and the development of kind of mobile internet, but also even the development of this kind of tremendous amount of information that produces the internet, that is the net, if you will, is not just tied to technology, but has altered culture fundamentally. Our sense of self is utterly being redefined. What our notions of public and private is being radically redefined, if not utterly abolished. There are kind of cultural impacts, such as, for example, a kind of constant remixing of the past and the present that's very different from the postmodern. Such as, for example, I mean, I can just invoke Instagram as an example for you, but also whether the works of Cedric Delceau, an artist who blends Star Wars images with images of contemporary cities in France or in Dubai, whether we look at this kind of home cultural movement to create fake covers for fake books on Twitter and other internet companies that are based to look like the 60s. This kind of constant remix of these things, kind of photographs recreating one's photographs one takes now with one's family, recreating images from the past. So these are the kind of things we became interested in the Netlab. The kind of the cultural implications of such matters, and we have, we've where to start. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the infrastructural city for more than a minute, since for one reason one thing is I talked about it last time I was in San Francisco. Not that most of you were there, but I still think it bears not discussing for it because of that. But still, it was a book that we published in 2008 in which we looked at the kind of the changes towards landscape that are happening in a kind of not even postmodern culture, but in a culture that has come since, a culture in which on the one hand there's a kind of hybridization between technology and life that is unprecedented and new, and on the other hand a kind of hybridization of environments that, in which, in this case, these Smithson-esque remediation systems in the Owens Valley, in this case, the kind of over-monitoring of the roads in our cities, of course, things like One Wilshire we've already talked about, the kind of strange hybrid of the David Fletcher, who's in the audience, did a fantastic project on the strange hybrid of river and man-made system that now has its own ecology, that is the LA River, that is, for all the talk about restoring the LA River, this thing now has a new kind of ecology that is far removed from anything that existed before, and is now really a kind of a marker, a kind of a monument to what's been called the Anthropocene Era. Or for that matter, this city of, Matt Coolidge did this project in the city of Irwindale in which, for the infrastructural city in the east, in the San Bernardino and San Gabriel Valley, and near San Bernardino, and in this case, Irwindale has let itself be mined for gravel to essentially be dug out, a city that has disappeared. So that was one project we did, and again, all those projects were real, and yet they all, a city like almost like an Italo Calvino-like city that disappears, that digs itself away, a river that is simply a kind of hybrid ecosystem that has that is now an utterly unprecedented ecological condition. Remediation systems that that aren't meant to restore conditions back to at the Owens Lake and the Owens Valley to their natural state, but rather to just simply alleviate what exists there, to alleviate pollution controls, and then therefore have their own kind of feedback effects and their own disruptions. So these are all projects. This is all one project we did. Just to talk very briefly in the next 5 minutes about a couple more projects. We've been very interested in a kind of a long-term project on financialization and the kind of the housing crisis and after is a kind of end game for capitalism. The over complexity of the contemporary economy and its relationship to the city. This is a drawing by Leah Dennis from the Network Architecture Lab, and I think Kyle Hovenkoter was also working on this one with her, in which she we examined the housing crisis graphically to explain just what happened, because it was apparently, as we were told, it was too complex to otherwise understand. We've been very interested in projects and been working on trying to understand the how high-speed trading and the development of these kind of places like this. This is essentially a server farm. It's now the real headquarters of the New York Stock Exchange. It's not on Wall Street, but it's here in Mahwah, New Jersey, about 40 miles away, where there's a set of these servers all stuck in this giant box that's extremely fortified. I probably could have gone to jail for taking this photo. Luckily, I didn't. But that it looks essentially like a prison. It's actually located on a spot in between two grids, in between the electric grid of that for most of New Jersey, and also related to New York City, but then also another one. So in case of a power outage, even notwithstanding, it has days upon days of fuel there. It has multiple freeways heading there. It's essentially It's essentially indestructible, super fortified, and there's also another one just like it that nobody knows where it is somewhere in the country that could pick it up if it failed. And there's also one in London that's a twin for it. So this is a kind of a world where finance begins to have a kind of life of its own that is simply uncomprehendable by even the people involved because of its of the kind of the temporalities and conditions involved. So it was those projects, certainly the one we're doing at MoMA. And one last project I'll just sort of talk to you about that was, kind of a form of research or speculation that speculated on the role of newspapers in the city. Joseph Grima and I were asked to do a project for this show called The Last Newspaper at the New Museum, right at a moment when newspapers seemed to be in extreme crisis. And Joseph and I were interested in how we might be reading, these people might be reading texts, or they might be, it's a little bit of an old image anyway, or we might be reading the news, but at the same time, there's a condition where, that is a very different, there's a kind of privacy to reading the news. When I was a kid, my father would read the newspaper every morning. Now, my kids, they don't know. They'll be playing on their iPads. Maybe I'm sending email, or maybe I'm reading newspaper. We don't know that anymore. There's a kind of a loss of this kind of civicness of knowing what newspapers were. And so we were both, Joseph and I, kind of independently got, Joseph actually, I guess maybe a little bit earlier, but I'd also been interested in this idea of how newspapers used to, and sometimes still do, appear in public. Here, I think in Hungary, when they're hung up, when they appear in public in places. Joseph was interested in how this happened in China, where there's a relationship to something called dazibao, these kind of papers or bulletins that had been put up during the Cultural Revolution that tended to do things like shame university professors and so forth. But the idea of posting something in public became interesting to us, of producing a newspaper that would then not be read privately but would be read in public, and to adopt that kind of graphic language. So we actually created a newspaper office at the New Museum, and this is our office here. I'm in the gallery, and we published one section a week. This is the first section we published, which was a Netlab project on the blackout of 1977 in New York City, a kind of the low point of say the city's recent history, and the role of newspapers in it. Because again, one of our theses was that if one friend of mine once said that when he works, he sometimes has to consult to develop competitions or small short lists of like what architect should be doing what museum, and inevitably the museum director says, whoever it is has to get me on the front page of the New York Times. So whether it's that or the newspaper's role, you notice how newspapers didn't talk about the real estate crisis coming because, of course, they have real estate sections, and they couldn't lose that advertising. So newspapers as these players in cities, these shapers of urban agendas, this became something very interesting to us. And so we published one section a week, curated by each one in turn, done by different architects who put together groups. So there's this is a Princeton team that did a project on culture, led by Beatrice Colomina. This is our staff. And among them, kind of the key members, Alan Rapp and Daniel Payne, who did the kind of editorial work. Daniel was a student of mine. Alan actually also was a student, but did Decrit. He's an editor. And we produced, again, a paper a week, which was kind of a huge project. They were big. The papers were literally bigger than the New York Times. They were an old size of paper, a folio size, that no longer exists. In the end, and I wish I'd brought one, but too bad, the New City Reader was bigger than the actual Sunday Times when we put it together at the end of the run. We had a political cartoonist who named, if you go to Klaus Toon, you can find our political cartoons and also the ones he did. He's an architect, Koldo Luce, who produces these political cartoons and just does amazing work. We had Neil Donnelly did the graphic design, and all the papers were designed to be hung up and hung up in public, and they were hung up in the window of the new museum, and they were also hung up on the facade of storefront. And here's Daniel and Alan also literally pasting the newspaper to the facade of storefront. Later, we kind of had to have a discussion about how we're going to clean the storefront off, but I think we got away with that one somehow, and some more images of it. And you can find all of these at newcityreader.net. But the interest here was also finding ways in which we could speculate as architects, and we could suggest, like, okay, this is a project in some ways, well, maybe you don't need to be an architect to do. At the same time, it is a project that, for one, involved a kind of architectural large scale management of a vast number of people. It involved actually thinking about what a newspaper's role was urbanistically, bringing a newspaper into the streets at a time when it was retreating from them, hanging it up in order that people would read it, would look at it, and would try to make sense of their world, that they would hopefully have shared experience of it. The one downside of it, when people ask, well, did you learn any lessons? We did find out some things very quickly. For one, we found out that because we had a very short lead time on the project, it wasn't enough to secure enough sites. And by the time the city told us that we could use MTA sites, it had taken months and it was already too cold to start to do this. And then otherwise, Joseph had this great idea. We could just paste the newspapers everywhere, like on this fencing on construction sites. And then I found out, but the problem with that was, one, our names were on there, so was the university's name and the new museum's name, and those sites were either controlled by, and we would either get in trouble with the city, who would say we're posting them illegally, and fine the university, the new museum, and us like $30,000, which would lead to my firing and Joseph getting into deep trouble. Or they were controlled, or these sites were controlled by the mafia, so we would also have our kneecaps broken. So it turned out we found out that this was something we couldn't do, even though it seemed like something we could. So it wound up, there was a little bit of a problem with that, but it wound up still on the facade of storefront, and hopefully it will also, the project will spread. It was also shown in a second New City Reader was done in Istanbul, and our hope is that this will go around and read not just one city, but we'll read other cities. So that's it. And David, would you like to lead a kind of response or ask some questions? Or yeah, there you are. Thank you.